Globally, as of September 2023, there have been over 700 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, including close to 7 million deaths reported to the World Health Organization, and over 13 billion vaccine doses have been administered to people all around the world. Critical reflection in academic research can highlight the politicization of science and its impact on how people respond to beneficial and scientific advice. Join the Economic Leadership Council in this podcast-like symposium as we hold a private space with top subject matter experts in fields of super excited to talk about this amazing topic, polarization of COVID and Black American Symposium. Today we have top subject matter experts who've been in the field well over 10 years to talk about the polarization of science impacts how people respond to beneficial and scientific advice. We have a doctor that's been in the field, hands-on, on the ground, that has a wealth of information about infectious diseases and how this impacts the world, as well as, the Black community. So we're going to jump into this amazing information. But before we start, guys, I want to give you guys a quick background about who we are, what the purpose is, what our intentions are, and how we plan to move forward. So who we are, the Economic Leadership Council. We are a program of global leaders with a desire to drive social transformation and innovation through shared content and engagement such as this. Our number one goal is to provide a safe space for new discussions with critical thinkers like yourselves who seek transformation in areas of public policy, relationships, business, and of course, the global economy. So we know that we're moving into the fourth industrial revolution. My background is in economic development, planning, and policy. So it's important when we talk about this conversation of polarization that we think in the global context of how we're moving forward, in our global economy. So we know we have a quote here from the World Economic Forum, and it talks about the fourth industrial revolution. It's not just technology or business, but it's about society. And we're going to see later on as we go into the conversation how COVID and this post world of COVID, how it ties into, how we're going to move forward, right? This picture is very important when we talk about society moving forward. I love this image because it just gives us an overall perspective of how we think about globalization and economic and community development, right? So oftentimes we talk about economic development or the economy, and that's that core, right? When we think about the world, right? That would be that core focus. But there are other factors that impact our world that sometimes we can't see, right? And that's society, culture, education, health, justice, and security. Also, our environment, right? We're based here in New York City. New York City is impacted by several climate crises, whether it was from Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, and many other quality of life issues that we have here. So it's important for us to be able to talk about this in an intellectual way with top subject matter experts and just to talk about how we're going to move forward in society. These are some of the events that we put together in the past around digital equity. We provide trainings and mentorship and advisory services to our clients around civic and democratic education, economic planning, and of course, leadership development. This is a picture of some of the work that we have based out in East Africa, where we have chapters, the economic leadership chapters growing all around the world, where leaders like yourselves are having these very important conversations, shaping their global economy, their local economy as well. So at this time, I want to jump right into our featured speakers. I'm super excited about this conversation because it's really important, and I'll have to tell you guys a story. So I ran, I'm from New York here, and New York was one of the first places where the COVID pandemic hit. Particularly in my area, Southeast Queens was considered a hotspot. At the time when the COVID pandemic broke out, I served as the Director of Economic Development for the New York State Legislature. And at the time, our governor was Governor Cuomo. So I have firsthand experience on how this pandemic rolled out, being an essential first responder in a sense, out there in the community, doing wellness check-ins, ensuring that we have resources, going to our healthcare institutions, our first time responders, checking on our seniors. And so we want to first acknowledge and just give,
I guess we could just have a moment of silence for those that we lost during the pandemic, as well as just acknowledge all the sacrifice that everyone has played into ensuring that societies remain open. Okay. So at this time, I would like to just jump into this information. So I'll tell you guys a story. There's a gentleman who was a phenomenal leader. His name is Riza. He had an event a few weeks ago called Infectious Diseases in Black America. And it was a very important topic, I thought, as it impacts the world. And I had an opportunity to meet Dr. Lane Rowling during this conversation where he provided very high level scientific information about the impact of infectious diseases, which includes the COVID pandemic or the COVID virus. And I had an opportunity to learn a lot. I had an opportunity to engage in conversation with him after the event, and I thought it was really important for us to further this conversation in the context of polarization. He said, Latoya, this is the topic. He said, you need to focus on polarization. He gave me the word. And as a political scientist, I have a master's in urban policy, and I'm currently a master's student in international affairs and a pre-law major. It was important for us to do the research. And upon me doing my research, I came across a phenomenal professor based at Georgia University, Professor Toby, who has some incredible research that was published on the web that specifically talked about the politicization of COVID. And then I had an amazing opportunity to reach out to him to talk about his research, and he was happy enough to join us and Dr. Rowling in this phenomenal conversation to provide more context. So with that, guys, that is the nature of this conversation. We're going to jump into the information. So I wanted to just give us some context on what we're talking about here. So we're going to be talking about the COVID impact. If you guys saw some of our presentations, we highlighted, according to the World Health Organization, billions of people were impacted, right? There's reports about, over 700 billion confirmed cases of COVID, right? There's over 100 million billions doses were released, and over 6 million deaths were reported, right? So there's a lot of information, there's a lot of data that has come out, has been released since the time the pandemic started to now, and we have enough data to dig in and to talk about it, right? Some of the current events, just to shape the conversation further, now that we're about 2-3 years into the pandemic, we see executive orders and policy changing all across the world, right? These are some current events in the news where, for New York, for example, the COVID vaccine mandates for health workers, is getting ready to be appealed, according to the Attorney General. We have the executive order at the federal level that was removed for federal workers. So we see changes. We see how health influenced politics and how health influenced policies, and we see the change in this now, or whether we know why or why not, right? So as we listen to these subject matter experts that's getting ready to speak, I want you to make sure that our audience is playing a role, just thinking about what is your role in disaster recovery. Because the reality is this was a pandemic. This was not the first pandemic we've been in, but it may not be the last, right? So as we move forward, we need to think about what our role is here in society in terms of disasters. Are you looking at this from a preparedness perspective, right? Are you the person that's going to take a leadership role in relief? Or are you going to take a leadership role in recovery? And so with that, that's something to think about. Although this is the politicization of COVID in Black America, but we know that COVID impacted the whole world, and we are all in the same boat. So we're not talking about one demographic against the other. We're just highlighting a specific variable, and it's important for us to have this dialogue because there's power in dialogue. And one quote that I would like to leave the audience before we move over to our speakers is that power over opinion is a form of power. So we can have differences of opinion, but it's very, very important for us to have dialogue that shapes opinion because your opinion matters. Okay. And with that, I would like to open it up and introduce Professor Dr. Toby. And Dr. Toby is a professor at the Department of Political Science at Georgia State University. His research focuses on political and science communication, public opinion, public behavior, experimental methods, and U.S. energy and climate policy. Everyone, please help me welcome Professor Toby.
Well, thank you so much. I think you may want to make me the host here so I can share my screen. And while you're doing that, I just want to thank you, Latoya, very much for inviting me to speak. Thank you for being, also for Dr. Rowling for being here with me. I will keep an eye on my time and try to not spend. I probably have too many slides, so I'm going to keep a close eye on this clock and make sure I'm not longer than 20 to 25 minutes. Is my target anyway. And so. As Latoya mentioned, my name is Toby Bolson. I am a political scientist at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And I'm going to be speaking tonight about, as a political scientist, about the politicization of science itself and what that meant and how that happened and some of the things that took place during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so as I get started, I think I'll go ahead and share my screen and pull up some visuals that I have to accompany my presentation tonight. And I'm going to start the slideshow. Let's see. Slideshow from start. Can you all see my screen okay? I guess I can drop this down so I can see. Thumbs up on some thumbs up. Great. Okay. So, well, again, thank you for having me tonight. And thank you all for being here to listen to the presentation. Just to give you a quick roadmap for the talk, I really want to kind of talk about three sort of sections of this presentation tonight. One, first, talking about what do we mean when we're talking about the politicization of science, and why does that present a threat for, public health, for public decision making, and for collective decision making for societies. And I also want to talk about, factors that influence people's general receptivity to misinformation, scientific misinformation in politicized contexts. And then finally kind of close out with talking about what can we do? What do we know about what we can do to maybe overcome some of these challenges? Before I move on, though, to define a couple of terms, we talk about misinformation, because as a political scientist, I need to define, as a social scientist, to define concepts. Misinformation is referring to communications that are false, misleading, or based on unsubstantiated information. And this can come in many guises, rumors, fake news, conspiracy theories. But these have distorted people's political views about some of the most consequential issues in politics, science, and medicine. And so that's what misinformation is. We talk about scientific misinformation. We're talking about claims that are unsupported or contradicted by the scientific community's best available information, which can lead to misperceptions. And these are particularly clear in contexts that become politicized, as I'll talk about. And then finally, again, I'll finish up by talking about what we can sort of do to overcome these challenges. So first, we know that science can play an important role in informing policymakers, in improving decision-making, collective decision-making, improving individuals' decision-making. So, okay, then why would science become politicized or contested? And part of this is because with science, there's an inherent uncertainty with any scientific sort of finding or set of findings. And these can be easy to challenge because science itself, the scientific process is uncertainty is an unavoidable part of this process. And questioning existent knowledge, questioning the research process is part of that. However, one of the primary ways that science can be politicized is separate from this sort of regular process of questioning findings and research, but it's when actors emphasize the inherent uncertainty of a scientific consensus in order to plant doubt among the public, and cast doubt on the existence of a scientific consensus. And I'll come back and talk more about that in just a minute. And so we know that, it could just be that people have mistaken information. They may not have the facts, but people can also, it's not a matter of lacking factual information. Their misinformation or misperceptions may be related to beliefs in existing beliefs in various conspiracy theories. And so, in the case of COVID-19, conspiracy theories singled out China, Russia, Bill Gates, Democrats, the deep state, and the pharmaceutical industry as potential actors who were involved in sort of some kind of conspiracy with COVID. And so, in a national survey found in 2020, in June of 2020, U.S. adults had stronger conspiracy theories that were endorsed by partisan figures had a stronger impact on audiences' levels of misinformation about COVID compared to medical information about the transmissibility of the virus. And really, the bottom line is that individuals who are more open to believing in conspiracy theories, especially on issues where there's politicization and partisan polarization, tend to be more resistant to scientific information, more open to science politicization, and less willing to engage in pro-social behaviors during the pandemic. When we get to discussing what is politicization itself, then, I want to be a little bit careful to define this. When we talk about polarization or issues becoming politicized, often we're talking about partisan issues that are defined by partisan divisions, right? But what I want to make clear here is that when I talk about the politicization of science, we're talking about a rhetorical tactic that is used that actors can cast doubt. Can we really trust the science? Can we be sure that's true? Think of, the tobacco industry sort of questioning early in the 90s whether of a scientific consensus by actors. And when this happens, who are in pursuit of a political agenda. And when this happens, the public often becomes distrustful about science when it's invoked in sort of what seems a political debate. There's decreased trust in science. And in some of our prior research outside, this is a prior paper that I had you see on the screen with some co-authors at Northwestern University. We looked at how, scientific consensus information about clean energy technologies has a positive, strong impact in the absence of context where those findings are politicized. When they're politicized, it renders that consensus scientific information neutral. It has no impact on audiences, and they become more anxious, less trustful, and less supportive of actions to adopt clean energy. And so when we talk about what can we do, so what do we do with politicization? And stick to the science when the science gets political. Communicate the consensus. Communicate the expert consensus. There's a lot of folks out there advocating that we just need to message correctly. And so, part of this could be that the public just isn't informed. They have limited epistemic capacity to sort of understand scientific findings. A recent study, national survey, showed that 77% of respondents couldn't explain the idea behind a scientific study, and 36% had trouble understanding sort of probabilities, which sort of present obstacles in some cases to simply communicating facts. And as we know, and I'll talk later, facts require interpretation, and those can depend upon a lot of other factors besides just scientific or expert advice. And so, the goal with this research is, to figure out why people are rejecting scientific information and what steps broadly can be taken to overcome this resistance. And so I want to talk now, that was a lot of background there, but I want to get into specifically with the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to provide some specific examples of how COVID became politicized as a result of statements by political leaders, and information that was reported in media accounts and also on social media. And so broadly, what I'm going to talk about next is sort of how politicization began with sort of, well, I think first of all, the politicization of the nature of the virus and the threat the virus presented itself, then subsequent media coverage about this nature of the virus that spilled over into a political presidential election year where partisan divisions were hyper present in the news, and that spilled over into sort of a lot of vaccine hesitancy that I'll talk about in just a moment. So when we talk about, these statements when, this virus when the pandemic initially started and when the virus outbroke, again, remember, I want to just star this, that 2020 was a presidential election year. And so everything that occurred, especially, we're dealing with this global pandemic but it's hyper politicized. And we may remember that in early 2020, when it first broke out, President Trump initially downplayed the threat posed by COVID, comparing it to the flu in public remarks, also labeled it a new, quote, a new hoax at one point, quote, said that Democrats are politicizing this. The president promoted claims that the virus can be combated by injecting and drinking disinfectant, bleach, and promoted hydroxychloroquine as a cure. He also appeared in public without a mask and criticized his rival for the presidency, Joe Biden, for wearing one. Quote, "Did you ever see a man that likes masks as much as him? If I were a psychiatrist, I'd say this guy has some big issues," end quote. In other portions of the American public were influenced by many of the messages that were on Twitter, suggesting that the virus was either a hoax, wasn't that serious, or that unproven therapies could be used for it. Meanwhile, on partisan news, we saw a lot of differences in the types of coverage across different partisan news outlets. Right-wing media outlets, you see on Fox News, there was a lot of coverage about the origins of the virus from a Wuhan lab in China, as opposed to, at that time, the consensus position, which is still unsettled now, I should acknowledge, but that it was likely zoonotic in its origins. But we saw a lot of focus on that. We also saw conflicting partisan messaging propagated by various news sources. Studies of media coverage during the pandemic and the language that was used found sort of significant differences across news stations like Fox News versus CNN or MSNBC in terms of how frequent different phrases were used. For instance, Fox News was much more likely to use, language such as, quote, "normal flu," quote, "political weapon," quote, "flu panic," in their coverage on this during the outbreak in February 1st through April 30th of 2020. And so we saw, these are just a couple of examples. There are so many out there, but they just sort of illustrate some of the positions high profile partisan leaders took, and also how those, how this was covered in the partisan media as well. Just a quick mention, this is a study that two of my co-authors at Georgia State and I did that looked at how, providing people with information, randomized experiments that provide people with information about the origins of the virus affected their views about it, their willingness to want to spend money on biomedical research, and their willingness to engage in sort of pro-social actions during the pandemic. And the bottom line here is that we found that, these different messages about the origins of the virus actually had a powerful impact, not only on whether or not people believed it was zoonotic or human engineered, but also on downstream sort of willingness to want to penalize China, willingness to want to spend money on biomedical research, and also, yes. So, and also in their willingness to sort of engage in pro-social actions. They became less willing to take pro-social actions when they'd been exposed to sort of a conspiracy theory about the origins of the virus. Social media messages compounded this politicization of the COVID-19 pandemic virus. Stories that circulated widely on social media included false claims such as transmission of the coronavirus through mosquito bites, conspiracy theories that it's spread by 5G towers, pseudoscientific health therapies that could cure it, eating garlic or drinking bleach. And the speed and extent of this false information via social media was characterized as a kind of epidemic itself, a misinfodemic. And so this misinformation had powerful consequences. I also conducted another sort of survey experiment in the line of the work that I do in political science with public opinion and political communication research, looking at how exposure to different kinds of messages influenced people's willingness to take a vaccine when it became available. And so, we conducted this study before the first vaccines were available. Bottom line, we found powerful effects of different kinds of information on people's willingness to take vaccines when it was characterized and, as safe, effective. That had a strong positive impact, as opposed to when it was framed as, questions about its efficacy or safety. When the vaccines were, when there were frames that characterized that most Americans were planning to do this, so social norm-based messages, they became more likely to say they would take the vaccine, less likely when they were told less Americans were willing to do it. And finally, when the vaccine itself was politicized in certain conditions in our study, we found that people became sort of less willing to report being, interested in getting the vaccine when it became available, when they were, subject to claims that it was being politicized in the approval process. On May 15th, 2020, President Trump had announced Operation Warp Speed, this $10 billion funding from Congress to enable faster development and approval of the vaccine. There were concerns that this Operation Warp Speed, the frame of this warp speed, would even, play into the hands of anti-vaccine groups by raising concerns about implying that they were skipping important steps, as a quote from Dr. Fauci, talked about this, that you're going so fast that you're skipping over important steps and not paying enough attention to safety, which is absolutely not the case. But nonetheless, keep in mind that this was taking place during the heat of a presidential election year and a presidential election race, in which President Trump had stated that emergency authorization prior to election day would likely help his chances for re-election. The New York Times had published an article voicing concerns about an October surprise, which this, FDA might rush a vaccine's approval in order to please the president. And there was also a lot of rhetoric in that fall of that presidential election year about government mandates over vaccinations, concerns over immunization cards that people might be required to carry, losses of individual rights by allowing government to take control of personal health decisions. And so, the politicization of the vaccine's approval process, the idea that the vaccine might be released before the election, all of this played into reducing the public's confidence in the vaccines and their safety and reducing the intentions to get vaccinated. And so over time, what we saw subsequently into 2021, the summer of 2021, was partisan divisions and polarization over vaccine uptake. Republicans were more likely than Democrats to believe anti-vaccine information. There's this distrust that there was a lot of rhetoric out there, populist rhetoric, distrust of elites, distrust of experts, anti-intellectual considerations being made salient in the public that had negative effects on sort of vaccine uptake. And so to the last part here to close out, what do we do? Where do we go from here? We know what happened. We know the roots of this polarization. We know what happened in that election year, and we know what's happened even subsequently. The story could be lengthened to talk about, debates over subsequent mask mandates, debates that have followed since 2021, 2022, into even the present time. What we see in 2021, 52% of Republicans had at least one dose of the vaccine, compared to nearly 90% of Democrats. Other evidence that politics played a role: 17 of the 20 states with the lowest vaccination rates in summer 2021 were carried by Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential election. So what to do? Well, we don't have a great answer for this. This is where research is at. How do we overcome the power of misinformation? How can we blunt the impacts and challenges that politicization pose? Here you see a picture of Senator Raphael Warnock from my state of Georgia. Back when he was first being introduced to voters, he ran a commercial just saying, "Hi, I'm Reverend Raphael Warnock. I'm running for Senate, and I like puppies. You're going to hear a lot of bad things about me. Don't believe all these things are not true. Here's what I really stand for." And so this was an effort to sort of preempt, before all the negative information come out in the period he was running during that runoff election, all of this negative information by refuting it, by pre-bunking it. And so in some of my other research, again, on other topics, we've looked at ways to counteract politicization through pre-bunking that information, warning people, refuting it, or trying to sort of inoculate people against it, right? By giving them, anticipating when it's going to happen, giving them a dose. You may hear this, but this isn't accurate. Refuting that information and then establishing an initial belief that then helps them, sort of bolsters them against subsequent misinformation or politicization about vaccines. The problem here is it requires anticipating it. This stuff can spread super fast in this digital age that we live in. And so there can be sort of challenges with being able to pre-bunk this stuff before it's already out there. Another important factor is that, even if we do communicate the consensus, communicate the scientific facts, pre-bunk, warn, inoculate, pursue these, best practices in communication strategy, we still have to deal with the fact that people encounter new information with motivations. And motivated reasoning in the process of information, of scientific information, it indicates that facts require interpretation. And we tend to interpret information in ways that bolster our existing beliefs and bolster our existing so important social identities. So the question is, how can we get people to move away from this defensive forms of information processing and motivate them to more balanced and even-handed understandings of scientific information, scientific consensus information, in order to arrive at better decisions, public health decisions? This is not easy. I can talk about it in Q&A if you're interested. We know we can shift people's motivations in labs experiments. When we try to do this in sort of wide scale environments, we don't have as much guidance on that. Finally, we know that, even when people have become sort of pursuing balanced, even-handed, even they're trying, if they're pursuing an accuracy motivation, not defensive information processing, sometimes polarization can result just because of differences in the perceived credibility of new information. So we've done prior work in climate change, for instance, that looks at how sort of what happens when different kinds of information are attributed to in-group leaders, Republican Party leaders rather than Democratic Party leaders, or military officials, or climate. So the bottom line is that the messenger can play a powerful role in whether or not we can overcome politicization. We need credible messengers in order to persuade people, to affect people's opinions. I will move along quickly, just a couple of slides left here. Finally, there's a need to kind of find an awareness of, to have an awareness of these evolved information environments. We live in a context now where there's bots, there's trolls, there's dark money, there's this morally charged content that is shared on social media, gossiping, sharing of outrageous content, misinformation, which might be more costly in physical settings where people are interpersonal, are less costly and can even get positive rewards in the form of positive social feedbacks. So strategies that could be used to address this, are going to be more complex. They're going to require coordinated multidisciplinary efforts to identify groups that finance, produce, disseminate misinformation. But then, as we've even seen this weekend in the Washington Post, there's a lot of concerns about how to implement that in practice so as not to limit First Amendment rights. Another strategy could be developing technocognition, architectures in a post-truth era to help prevent the spread, identify and prevent the spread of misinformation and source. But the bottom line is there's still a lot of work to do to figure out how we can overcome these challenges that have been presented and are presented by science's politicization, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and especially as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, how all of this over time led to existing and high levels of partisan and political polarization in the U.S. So I want to thank you very, very much for your attention, and I hope that I didn't run too far over. I'm afraid actually that I did. I lost track of the clock as I thought I might, but I'm close to 30 minutes, I think. So thank you so much, and I'm all now finished. So.
All right. No, thank you so much, Professor. That was right on time. I appreciate the wealth of information you just shared. Wow. Definitely blown away. I've taken a lot of notes. I see Dr. Rowling nodding his head. I'm pretty sure he has a lot to share as well. And so that was just awesome. Thank you again. I hope you'll be able to stick around as we move forward in the conversation. I'm sure you and Dr. Rowling have lots to share and talk about, and as we open up the discussion. So Dr. Lane Rowling, again, he spoke at this event that was hosted by RZA. If you guys don't know who he is, you should definitely follow his profile and a lot of the work and advocacy work that he's been doing over the years. And this was hosted a few weeks ago. It's called Infectious Diseases in Black America. And I want to highlight this, for one, give credit to RZA and his platform for being bold to host a conversation, and to two, just to reintroduce my introduction to Dr. Lane Rowling. I had a chance to read, about him and listen to him on various podcasts, and he has a wealth of information that I could relate to his testimony and many things that he shares. So with that, I would like to open up the floor to Dr. Lane Rowling to talk more on the politicization of COVID in Black America. Dr.
Well, hey, thank you for that nice, warm welcome. Absolutely fantastic lecture, Dr. Toby, and I look forward to doing many more presentations because we're going to be in a endemic situation for at least the next 50 years. It's going to be a game changer. And the reality is that, one of the things that I've seen over the last 3 years as somebody in the first line responder to COVID, somebody on the COVID healthcare task force for the, the congressional Black legislators, the different platforms I've been in, from MSNBC, NPR, and all the work we do in the world. The reality is that this virus became really politicized, 100%. And the reason why I believe, and I think this is a great, to be able to piggyback off off of your lecture and your seminar, is the reality is that you're right. There was misinformation and people got into a lane that they shouldn't have been in. The reality, folks, is that that's what happened. That people were not trained, that nobody could forecast the future of this new COVID virus, which is really not a new virus itself. It's been around for thousands of years. The reality is that the virus just figured out how to jump into human beings. And then what happens is that it became a political ball where people were making statements that they couldn't even verify. And so when we take a step back, and I think it's important for on the content of this seminar, is that people need to understand that the coronavirus is one of the most mutagenic viruses on the planet. It's been here for thousands of years. 20,000 years ago, they had the first real pandemic of coronavirus. And then we didn't really discover it until about 1958 again, when we had the technology to be able to identify that using certain techniques like electron microscopy. It was identified in England. But the reality, folks, is that the coronavirus is a virus that will never, ever be eradicated because of its life source. It's found in every animal on the planet, from dolphins, monkeys, bats, etc. And most pandemics themselves jump off from, guess what, folks? They jump off from wet markets, i.e. from some exotic animal. It's always an animal transferred to a human being, and that's usually kicks off most pandemics. We can talk about influenza, we can talk about the bubonic plague, and multiple different diseases that have affected man since the history of man on this planet has some type of origin of an animal vector, which means the disease jumped from that individual animal to a human being. And so the reality here is that this was our biggest problem, is that this became a social, phenom, where people really mentally couldn't help the fact that there was something out there that human beings really had no control over. And this time it really affected them, i.e. you had a virus that is so small, it doesn't recognize borders, it speaks every language in the world, and has the ability to go where it wants to go, when it wants to go, and it's going to do what it wants to do. The virus itself has its own passport. And this is where I think a lot of people on the politicization realize that this is something that they really thought they could have a control over, and they really didn't have control over. And Professor, you're absolutely correct when you said earlier that Donald Trump said this is going to be a flu, it's going to go away in the springtime. Drink Clorox bleach, and then you have mouthpieces like Dr. Fauci out there something that was not really real because the science did not back up what the information they were pumping out. And this became a narrative where, who had control over social media, i.e. Instagram, i.e. Facebook, whatever the case is. Even for myself, who is just a straight up just science and a doctor dealing with diseases on a regular basis, I was very naive because my responsibility was to be able to articulate what the virus is, how you get infected with virus, how do you navigate through a pandemic or an endemic infection, and also how do you treat it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what happened was that the narrative became so strong that you have people like Fauci and these guys, what they were was really practicing misinformation. And that was the sad thing about it. And then you're absolutely correct. You get a Republican, Democratic point of view, whose narrative was better, told you the people that got vaccinated. But at the end of the day, the reality is that the scientific observation was not done. The scientific observation should have been, hey, this is a virus. How is this virus transmitted? What is our hypothesis? How do we prove it? What is our conclusion? Has it been verified? Is validated? And then what happens is you come up with policy at the best information you had, and not speculating. So folks, let's keep it real. Now we know for a fact that when we look at social media, this was also completely dictated. The reality was not based off of reality that we know in the scientific committee, because in the scientific world and committees, is that at the end of the day, it usually takes about 10 years to make a vaccine. And there's a reason why, because you have to be able to test every individual in different population. It might be somebody that has multiple sclerosis for the COVID vaccine, somebody in their first trimester of being pregnant, or somebody that has cancers and multiple different diseases, different racial groups. And this was not done. And this is where, when you really want to talk about the politicization of the virus, I've always said what should have happened was that they should have had that big mama conversation. They should have had somebody came on national television like myself and say, guys, this is a virus. This virus mutates. This is how you're infected with the virus, through fecal contamination, respiratory, or even secretions and stuff. This is how quick an infection occurs. What is the treatment for it? And at the end of the day, they did not that. That got lost in the message. And that's why when you look at folks like Fauci now, after the fact, that you have a guy that gets, subpoenaed by attorney generals of the state of Missouri and Louisiana, and he has 175 I don't knows. Or you have celebrities on television pushing a narrative on a particular race, i.e. the black race, then all of a sudden people are supposed to jump up and get the vaccine. And then this reminds people of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where the government had a plan, and that plan was to use people to be able to put a different narrative. And at the end of the day, when we peel back the onion, we know the science was wrong. And this is a reality where people really did have, and people truly need to have, vaccine hesitancy, and that's the reality. And for folks out there, when you start talking about the politicization of the vaccine and what the media was articulating, what the president was articulating, what Fauci was articulating, there is two words that I've always say when you're talking about vaccine itself: vaccine efficacy and vaccine effectiveness. Two different words, two different meanings. I.e., vaccine efficacy means that, folks, this is what they did for the Pfizer vaccine. I'm going to give everybody a little bit of a lesson on how they manufacture this vaccine. Well, Pfizer came up with the vaccine, got the genetic material from the Chinese. That's where the virus originated from. They took that and they made a copy of it. And then what they did, they grew up in batches and came up with a vaccine. And they tested in a certain population. Well, when you do vaccine manufacture, folks, you test your vaccine in the most healthiest people on the planet. So this time they took 18-year-olds to about 45 years old, white Germans, and they ran their vaccine program. Out of that program, 3 people got a headache, and that means that they got a 97% score, vaccine efficacy. But the reality, when you actually read their paper, and I've published this on Instagram and social media and talked about it on different platforms from Japan to England and Europe and the Caribbean and all over the world, is that when you look at their actual data, and we talk about data, everybody keeps talking about data. You're absolutely right. Sound medicine, sound information is based off of data. It has been consistently proven. The data proves that. And the reality is that when we look at the actual Pfizer paper, it tells you right in there that their vaccine only lasted 81 days, and they only tested it in these healthy white people. They say in their paper they did not test Blacks, minorities, pregnant females, children, autism, people with immunocompromised disease, people that were handicapped, heart transplant people. They said in their paper that study would have to be done. And guess what? The American population in the world became the guinea pig. And that is where the misinformation came, because people were trying to push a narrative. This is the first vaccine on the planet, the drug, that is, you look on television, there is nothing about informed consent. There's nothing about the complications. But you look at a football game, they'll put on some new drug for arthritis and tell you for 5 minutes that if you have a heart disease, you have gonorrhea, or HIV, etc., do not take this drug. Talk to your doctor. And by the time you listen to all the things on television, you be, man, I'm not going to take this drug. And this is the first drug in the planet that there's no informed consent. There's no television talking about the vaccine and all the possible complication. What was told to the American people, and people drunk the Kool-Aid, was that you get the vaccine, you wasn't going to get COVID. That was a narrative. And you can go back and look at the videotapes of Fauci saying that. Then after a while, when people start getting multiple infections from the vaccine, Then it was you decrease hospitalization. Really, it did not do that. And now what we're finding out, folks, now in our modern time, because it came out a week ago in a scientific paper, that a person vaccinated with the vaccine for COVID or unvaccinated produces 1,000 viruses every minute for 8 days, just breathing normally. So you can imagine the content of virus that comes out when somebody sneezes or somebody coughs. And this is the reality, is that showed you there that the vaccine has no credibility. It did not change the number of viruses being produced by somebody infected with the COVID and also had the booster shot. No results at all. And then when you play that into the reality, this is the science actually catching up to what happened in 2020. That is why it takes 10 years for people to get a vaccine to come to market. When you take a step back, folks, and you look at the reality of what they did, they rushed something that had no credibility. There was no scientific, history or validation from other people with different opinion. It came down to what they told you to do, and the reality is that now we're picking up the pieces. I.e., we see all the complications from the vaccine, i.e., reactivation of cancers, Guillain-Barré syndrome, Bell's palsy, autoimmune diseases, sterility, increase in cancer, everything from bladder cancer to lung cancer to brain cancer to myocarditis of the heart, arrhythmias, complications, etc. Now we know the couple hundred complications that you can get from the vaccine itself and also from the virus itself. So this vaccine had no credibility, and the credibility was lost in the politicization of the vaccine on who said, she said. And the reality, if they would have took real scientists that had actual field experience and understand viruses in themselves as virologists, then we wouldn't have gotten to the situation. The situation would be, hey, there's a reason why you wear a mask. Well, you wear a mask, folks, because of the viral load. Now we know that the virus produces 1,000 viruses every minute for 8 days. And guess what? It takes 300 viruses to cause an infection. Well, there's a reason why we wear a mask. It's to decrease the viral load. Is a mask itself 100% guaranteed? Absolutely not, depending on what type of mask you have. But the reality is that you decrease the viral load, i.e., somebody sneezes in the general public, you walk through it, you have your mask on. Well, maybe instead of getting 1 million viruses, you might get 20, maybe you get 100, but you don't get to that threshold of 300 to cause an infection. And vice versa, somebody infected with the virus, like the numbers in the science says, is that you produce 1,000 viruses every minute for 8 days, and somebody's infected in their home or they're out in public, that mass decreases the amount of virus load that's being expelled to the environment. That is the scientific meaning of how you understand science. Why do we do what we do? I.e., when the paper comes out on viral load coming out of people's, out of bowel movements, out of flatulence, out of people's rectum, that number is going to be 10 times the number of viruses coming out of when people breathe, because we've already done the study and we know that in the gastrointestinal tract, the cells that are infected in the gastrointestinal tract, the viral load is higher, which makes sense. And that is why when we talk about when does the pandemic end, the pandemic ends, folks, is when we're able to look at the viral load of what we call wastewater surveillance intelligence, and we look at the viral load in the sewage. And then we see there's no viruses in the sewage, there's no polio in the sewage. That is how we determine that a pandemic ends, when there's no viruses found in that sewage wastewater. That is a reflection on the population and health. If the population and health is healthy, there's no viruses, pandemic end. But as long as there are viruses, in particular COVID viruses in sewage, we're going to always be in a pandemic. And the reality, folks, is that we're not in a pandemic anymore. We're really in an endemic situation. What does that mean? Well, the virus is not going. And the difference when we look at the politicization of the virus, people are talking about the virus is going to go away in the springtime like the flu. Well, this virus doesn't recognize that dogma. This virus doesn't care about fall. It doesn't care about winter. Doesn't care about summertime, springtime, fall time. And we already knew that as scientists in the beginning, because guess what? You were having cases of viral COVID infections in the jungles of the Amazon where the humidity is 100% and the temperature is 103. That tells you that that virus did not recognize the heat, or in Las Vegas. The reality is that this is politicization where people were trying to do a narrative that they couldn't fit, and they tried to censor people. And in particular, it really affected Black Americans because it became a problem where people saying, well, the blacks need to get vaccinated. Get vaccinated for what? And then it became, well, Big Mama is going to get her vaccination and we're going to give her a Subway sandwich, or we're going to bust her down. And then some of the universities I've dealt with, they were paying kids $50 to $500 to get the COVID vaccine on something that did not work. And now there's no credibility. Also, the politicization is of this virus was the fact you had celebrities, i.e. the Roland Martins in the world, i.e. the Sean Penns, the Howard Sterns, getting on television telling you if you did not get a vaccine, don't come here. You should be put in prison. You should lose your job. Whoopi Goldberg was behind that narrative. And now what we find out, the reality of the science, that they were completely wrong. There was the vaccinated people that were the super spreader of the infection. And that narrative has that narrative really end up hurting a lot of people, because I'm in the trenches. I'm the boots on the ground. I hear the stories, writing the letters for people for medical exemptions, people losing their jobs, people not being able to work, people lost their families because people pushed a certain narrative, and that narrative was completely wrong. And that is why when it comes to understanding diseases can be politicized. And what they tried to do was piggyback off of what happened with HIV. I'm sorry, HIV was a disease of gay men in the 80s. That was a reality. It is still the number one population in the world. And the bottom line at the end of the day, the people want to be sensitive. People want to be politically correct. Well, politically correct with the COVID virus is, guess what? The COVID virus can affect every cell in your body. The COVID virus is not going anywhere. The virus mutates every day in an individual. Your virus is going from the alpha strain, beta strain, gamma strain, delta strain, up to the omega strain, Omicron strain, where you have 100 mutations in the spike protein. And that tells you that the vaccine could not work, will not work, will never work, because there's no way in the world that any pharmaceutical company is going to try to predict and control a virus that mutates naturally in Mother Nature, or even in individual humans. How are you going to come up with a vaccine that's going to be able to eradicate that? And you're never, ever going to get 100% vaccine efficacy, effectiveness to be able to eradicate the virus. That is why this politicization became so important, because you had people out there talking about a vaccine, and you have people talking about natural immunity. Well, as a virologist and somebody that teaches immunology as a professor, natural immunity is always going to outweigh a vaccine. That is a principle. When I teach immunology, people don't realize our innate immune system is 700 million years old. Our adaptive immunity is 500 years old. Our body has been in tune to being subject to different viruses and microorganisms, microbial organisms for thousands of years. And the human body has proceeded to be able to be successful in navigating in this new world that we live in. And so the reality is that this vaccine had no credibility. Now it really doesn't have any credibility because the science is coming out more. In fact, we say it in our world, you never do a vaccination program in the middle of a pandemic, because what happens is the vaccine will drive the mutation. The virus itself is intelligent. They have awareness. They have the ability to mutate, to protect themselves. And the last thing I want to say before we open up for questions and stuff, because I could talk about this for days and years. And I want folks to understand that these viruses that we deal with are not new emerging viruses. These viruses have been around for thousands of years. The reality is man is coming into their territory, i.e. I work in the Amazon jungle. Well, when I go to the Amazon jungle, there are all types of viruses and bacteria and diseases that have been there for thousands of years. And then somehow I get in contact, or an individual gets in contact with that virus, be it monkey, be it a mosquito bite, whatever the case is, and that virus jumps to a human being. The reality, folks, is this is our new world. And our new world is that the politicization of the COVID vaccine and the virus has showed you the vulnerability of human beings, trying to put a narrative into something they have no control over. And the reality is that is what I believe. A lot of this was just people just downright scared. This is something you can't take an M16 rifle and shoot this virus. You can't drop a cruise missile or drone. It has nothing to do with space. All the technology we have in the world, guess what? This virus dictates and controls the message. And the reality, folks, is that this is your new norm. How to navigate into this new COVID world is very important. Understanding pandemics, understanding endemic, understanding that football games are super spreader events, i.e., this is a virus that you will be dealing with for the next 500 years because the genie is out the bottle. And the reality is that we have to have sound information based off of science. I am not a political major. I'll get an F in that, but I do get A's in science. And the people that are experts are the people that need to be making sure that the information in our business that we give people is very important, because in my business, people die, people get sick, people get injured. This is not where you can say, well, get a vaccine and then, you're fine, but you're not fine. You end up with a heart attack, arrhythmia, whatever the case is. You need to make sure that people are informed and that people really, truly understand the science. Like I always say, folks, in all my classes that I teach in the world, if you understand the medicine, you have to know the science. If you know the science, you understand the medicine 100%. It's got to be that way, because in our business, we deal with real lives, and the effect on people is tremendous. And I've seen firsthand what vaccines can do in a positive way when I'm doing vaccination programs in the jungles, giving kids measles, mumps, diphtheria, polio, etc. And I've seen the negative effects when people don't get certain vaccines, i.e., I've seen children, babies die from tetanus. I've seen babies die from diphtheria where they can't breathe anymore. I've seen the consequences of what vaccines can do, both positive and negative. And there's a positive thing for vaccine, but it has to be implemented right. And you have to have the right people giving the message and stuff. And at the end of the day, the science always is going to tell you the reality of what's going to happen. Folks, you might not get that answer today in science, but I promise you, there are some scientists out there that is trying to prove that theory, i.e., the virus comes out every minute, for 8 days straight. That's a lot of viruses, and it takes 300 viruses to infect you. Well, if they'd have had that information 3 years ago, there wouldn't be anybody getting this vaccine, because the vaccine did not have the credibility and will never have the credibility. And that would have changed the whole dynamics if people would have been straight up honest. And so the politicization of this vaccine was awful. And in one way, it was really genocide because of the complications that are people still having. We're going to see more as the information comes out. And then the people like the Dr. Fauci's and the Roland Martins and the people that push a narrative that wasn't correct, they're going to pay the consequences. But the sad thing is that our society is going to pay the consequences. And we have to make sure that from here on out, that the information is appropriate, accurate, based off of science. And the reality, folks, is that we have a long way to go. And make sure you guys are listening to folks like Dr. Toby, myself, that are really grounded in the academics. The academics is real world. When I tell you something in science, trust me, I've seen it in the real world. And when you take academics, you take real life, you come up with a pretty good outcome. And that's all I need to say. And then we can open this up for questions and answers.
Awesome. Wow, Dr. Rowling, thank you so much for that incredible information. That was powerful. I thought you were going to have slides, but I was just imagining as you were going along, and just thank you so much for that. I have so many questions. I want to open up the discussion. Professor Toby, if you're still on, if you
I am here, but I lost my video, and so I'm very sorry about that.
Okay,
I had to change out computers during the middle of
no worries.
things.
No worries. Let's get you back. Let's get you back on video so we can open it up. And I guess I'll start off, I'll give you first preference. Professor, do you want to start off the questions? Do you have any questions or comments you want to share at this time?
Well, I think Dr. Toby was absolutely spot on. I love the research. I love the way his information really showed a different side that people don't see, the misinformation and the disinformation. So that's very important. that he was able to talk about the narrative that was projected with the president down to Dr. Fauci and everybody else. And that was really, in on honesty, misinformation, because it wasn't based off the science and stuff. It was not based off of what the reality is on the ground now, because now we see the reality. And the only thing people can say, and when people talk about the virus, only I would tell people, remember, 1,000 viruses every minute for 8 days, you're infected, period. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. That's what you breathe out. And that means that the vaccine has no credibility, never had any credibility. And people need to be aware of the reality of that. They can be super spreaders themselves.
So absolutely, absolutely. I'm going to go back and forth between you guys because I have a lot of questions. And Professor Toby, did you have a question or comment you wanted to share?
Oh, I would say thank you so much. I wanted to, I'm certainly the expert on, more of the expert, I guess, on social science, political aspects of it. I'm certainly not medical. I mean, that's obvious given my field. So I am not the person to ask about those things. One thing I did think that was interesting, I wanted to ask Dr. Rowland, do you think I wanted to ask how much you think it mattered that the events took place in the backdrop of sort of a hyper political year, when like it seemed in this context where everything that went on would try to be spin in a certain way by the different sides of the partisan media. So I felt like, as you talked, that it was encouraging, because it felt like if we had scientists, experts delivering clear, accurate messaging, that we might have avoided sort of the events that ensued, I guess. And I just wonder, do you think that, I wonder in the abstract, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then I wonder in the real political world, about how these things actually come out, whether some level of sort of politicization. I mean, we know there have been a lot of, and this is independent of sort of partisan groups, but like anti-vaccine movements for decades, right? On different and I wonder how much of a difference you think it could have made if we had better messengers in the context in which it was in, if that question makes sense to you.
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfectly good sense. And I look forward to doing a co-paper with you. It'll be a nice paper to do that, all three of us, because we kind of understand the political situation. Our host, she dealt with Como and what was going on in New York. You've dealt with it, looking at it from a sociology, political point of view. And the reality is that was the biggest problem. They should have had myself or you on television giving people straight facts. And that was a big problem. I always say this, I always think that when it comes to Black folks, I say they should have had that big conversation, that come to Jesus meeting. Well, folks, hey, this is Dr. Rowland. Let me tell you what's going on. This is a national world problem. This is a virus. This is how this virus is transmitted. You get it this way. This virus came from here. Brought down the line. Why do we wear a mask? And that was not done. And that was a setup to the, MAGA hats and, who was on this, wearing a mask, not wearing a mask, infringing upon people's constitutional rights, i.e. I have tuberculosis, and guess what? I should go out and be allowed to go infect everybody instead of being quarantined or putting on a mask. And that became the political thing. And they mixed that up with the Republican Party as infringement on people's constitutional rights. And the Democrats on the other side was pushing something that, went back to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment on something that had no credibility. The people that got the vaccine were the guinea pigs. And at the end of the day, that is what should have happened. And then we're now finding out, because science always catches up down the road, the reality, and nobody can argue with the science. The vaccine did not decrease hospitalization. Paxlovid, you can read the paper now, has no effect on the new mutations. We can go down the line of everything that's been debunked, because the virus itself does not follow the politics. The virus itself does not follow a mask. The virus itself is going to speak its own language. And that is the biggest thing that I believe that a lot of human beings had a problem with. They finally realized there's something bigger and better than you that can control the narrative of your life, and certain infectious diseases certainly can.
Wow, no, that was really powerful. And I know we have a few audience attendees that just joined in the middle of the conversation, but we're going to keep it going. And so, I want to share this perspective because this is really tough, right? And, for someone like myself who has run for office, run for political office at two levels during the pandemic, I can tell you. And so, just even speaking with constituents, right, there was a lot of fear, right? And everyone had different perspectives when this thing, started off earlier on, right? And remember, at one point, people were saying, in terms of demographics and racial context, oh, Black people can't get the virus. I don't know if you guys ever heard that. I don't know. Did you guys hear that? Like, do you guys remember that? It was like, oh, there's only certain people that can get this virus. And then, then the language and the messaging, right? We're talking about messaging in a social science context, right? Then the messaging went from more fear and we started seeing people pass away. And I can talk, my community was a hot spot. One of my jobs was to call and check in to do wellness checks in the community. And our demographics, we're 50% young people, millennials, but we have a large baby boomer population. And I can tell you at one time, as we started to do the wellness checks, that the names started rolling in so fast in terms of deaths, I couldn't keep up, but, so there was a real factor. The community was impacted. However, we had historical issues and health inequities that already existed in our institutions and our communities prior to this pandemic. So, from my perspective, I felt that the pandemic exacerbated the existing conditions, right? And we didn't put enough effort and focus on providing the capacity that our institutions needed to just survive overall. And then there was a large push. And then, of course, as people are dying like that, it was scary, right? And I can say that I lost my stepfather earlier on, and, who had, pre-existing, typical pre-existing health conditions that exist in the Black community. And I mean, in terms of diabetes, high blood pressures, things that are academically documented, right? And so it was these vulnerable populations that I saw qualitatively that was impacted earlier on, right? And then there was a fear where there was a lot of people that wanted the vaccine before the vaccine was even manufactured, right? They were just like, hey, they were doing surveys. Do you want the vaccine? A lot of folks wanted the vaccine without even knowing what the vaccine was. And so I want to pose the question to you guys because as a political operative or political candidate, that wants to win, right? Like there's a thin line between your values and wanting to win, right? But then how do you as a politician, right? How do you operate in a space of crisis when you're getting information from the industry, right? And I guess that's the purpose of this conversation, for us to talk and think through this. But how does someone who's not a doctor or a scientist run to represent their community dealing with this type of information coming from the industry?
Well,
How would you
before I answer that question, I have a question for Dr. Toby. Doc, let me ask you a question. Do you think, in your opinion, what was the sociology behind all of a sudden we've seen so many Black folks on television, nurses, I don't know how many Black folks pushing drugs and giving people vaccination? What was the politicization of the COVID vaccine in African Americans? What is your opinion on that from your perspective and your expertise?
Well, again, from my outside, I would say, first of all, that you hit on some of this when you spoke earlier, when you deal with the history, with Tuskegee, with medical experimentation on Black Americans, with the structural racism that exists. I think that you are dealing with a population that's been exploited, right? I mean, and it's not even ancient history, because I believe President Clinton was the first to finally apologize for some of that experimentation in the
Correct.
90s. And so, I mean, that took place, decades earlier. So I think there is some of this comes down to independent, even aside from sort of all the politicization and messaging, I think some of this comes back to people's existing sort of trust in government, trust in government, and particularly with respect of the history of vaccination. So my understanding would be from sort of sociological political science perspective that higher levels of vaccine hesitancy, in part, just in generally speaking, not just with this pandemic, but in general, would be to due to those historical legacies of exploitation and experimentation and the lack of trust that has sort of engendered in the Black communities. So I don't know, did that answer kind of what I think that's a big part of it, right? I think they tried. So you also mentioned, one of the things I noticed during this was a lot of these targeted messaging appeals, right? And I think that's what you're getting at, is this idea with communication research is, all right, what we really have to do is use targeting messaging so that we can appeal to particular groups who might be resistant to this messaging. And I think that's where you see some of the kinds of messaging, dynamics that you mentioned there.
Well, I mean, it's true that what you say, because what I see on the field on the ground, on the boots on the ground, is that I see schools that weren't my students now that I teach in immunology. They weren't allowed to be on campus if they didn't have a COVID vaccine. That was another thing. They had these celebrities like the LeBron James and the Whoopi Goldbergs and the Sean Penns pushing the Roland Martins pushing a narrative that didn't have any scientific background behind. And I thought that was just a tragedy, because so many people were influenced by these so-called subject matter experts, and they're not. They're basketball players. They're celebrities. They don't know what a Bunsen burner is, but they're trying to dictate science, and that's just my viewpoint on that.
Yeah, no, very powerful, very powerful. One of the things why this conversation is so important is because, from my perspective, what I saw this pandemic shape policy, right? I saw this pandemic. I saw executive orders, which is a tool of policy used as economic sanctions. It's one thing to say you believe in the vaccine and you made a personal health choice. That's your personal business. There's a completely different thing when you have your government and a democracy, is what we've been taught this is to create incentives and economic sanctions where people are forced out of their jobs and their careers and their livelihood and their quality of life because of a health decision. And so it's very important that we have to talk about public opinion and the role of politicization, because in my perspective, I believe if the public was better educated and better informed, then there would have been a higher level of resistance, not necessarily to the vaccine itself, but to your ability to choose, right? And for one, and for the second thing, not allow a democratic society to create what is and what was executive orders designed as economic sanctions that ruin people's lives. And I look forward to more research and even myself working on highlighting the impact of those sanctions. And so and I'm going to open it up if there's any questions.
And you should, because the reality, it did affect people. I've seen it because I've written medical exemptions for folks. I've seen nurses lose their jobs, school teachers lose their jobs. People had their, even as a military officer, I've seen guys in the military end up losing their careers because they didn't want to get their vaccine via allergic reactions, whatever the case, to religious exemption. At the end of the day, you're absolutely right. Because at the end of the day, when you do this type of stuff, when you force a vaccine on a particular individual or a person and there's a complication, who's responsible? And the problem now is that now these guys are absolutely ghosts. Roland Martins, the Whoopi Goldbergs, the Sean Penns, the LeBron James, you can't hear a peep out of them guys now. Because they didn't have the background, they didn't have the pedigree to be able to articulate a vaccine, especially when it comes to medicine. And that is absolutely correct. What you say is that in the future, a politician like yourself, you have to have people that you understand the science. These guys are truly the subject matter, and there's no quid pro quo where Fauci's getting paid by the drug companies, the Roland Martins are getting paid by the drug companies to push a narrative because when your baby gets the vaccine, they have a complication. You're not going to find the Roland Martins, anybody there to be able to clean up the mess.
Wow, powerful. My last closing questions, I'll start with Professor Toby. What should, as a professor in a major prestigious academic institution, how should policymakers, or how can policymakers further partner with researchers and institutions like yourself to conduct studies to perhaps gain more insight into how people respond to future pandemics?
Good question.
That's a good question. You're going to put me right on the spot there. I think you know, well, academics certainly want to have their voices heard in the policy realm, right? That's our goal. I don't know how much we're always being listened to, but we sure like to think that our voices make a difference. So I'll take that question and think, I think that, one of the important things is that with academic research, that we're transparent about the research, that we're conducting it ethically, that we are communicating that effectively to these policymakers, because there is a demand for more of this policy relevant research, and they want academic research that's contributing to the public good, and the collective good. So I think there's space for that. Whether we're heard by those voices in the places of power is something that we can't always control. But I think, disseminating our findings, working, public engagement, speaking, trying to get that messaging out to as many people as we can, to share the expertise that we have, to share in a transparent way what our findings are, what we can conclude from those findings, to be open to criticism that others have about our recommendations, because I think we have to be also careful as academic, political scientists, that, or any kind of scientist, that, we can try to understand and test hypotheses, but that what we do with that information doesn't necessarily dictate a course of action for policy either. So I think that there requires, it doesn't mean we can't have our opinions about policy. It doesn't mean we can't put on our policy hat. It doesn't mean we can't advocate as democratic citizens. But I think we have to be careful to be clear when we're messaging and when we're taking off our academic researcher hat,
Right.
and when we are putting on our political advocacy hat, because if we mix those two, we risk being seen as part of the politicization actually itself, is what academics can do, and there's work on that. So we have to be careful, because, as I mentioned, actors, including scientists, can politicize science, and as Dr. Rowling has clearly made clear in his talk. So hope that that's my best effort to see how we can whisper into the ears of these policymakers.
That was an awesome answer. You're right. You cannot, when you start blurring the lines, that's when the messaging really gets messed up. And this is a sad thing about it. And you said something earlier, I noticed stuff. You're absolutely correct. The past is going to lead us to the future. And we are heading that way, because now we understand we have 3 years of COVID world pandemic, endemic. The virus is still here. Hospitalizations are going up. People are dying still. Here in Arkansas, where I live at, we have school closures. We have athletes that are athletic individuals that are infected. We have high schools that are shut down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this virus is not going anywhere. And, and my significant other, works in the pharmacy business and sees it every day, the amount of people coming into the pharmacy sick with COVID itself. So this disease is not going anywhere, and people are not wearing masks, and they're affecting other people. And that's where the sad thing about it is that the message got messed up in the beginning, and the future has already been determined because it's already out of control. And it's going to take individuals like yourself, myself, and the young lady here to be able to correct that message to get us back on track. But it's not going to happen in the next 3 or 4 years, folks. I apologize, but this virus is already loose.
Wow, a lot to take away. For those of in the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat now, or raise your hand. Let me know. I'll bring you up if you want to speak, if you have a question or comment. As you guys get your thoughts together, I'll just ask, one of my final questions is to Dr. Rowling. Dr. Rowling, how would you advise policymakers or political operatives like myself to, you talked about vaccine efficiency. What is some of the language or messaging that perhaps policymakers and political operatives could start to push in terms of highlighting that? Well, first define that vaccine efficiency, and how can we start pushing messaging around highlighting that?
Well, the reality is that you have to have, subject matter expert on your team that really understands infectious diseases. And now it's going to be more important now with infectious diseases because for both you guys, that we're just getting ready to start a brand new pandemic because we have so many illegal immigrants here. And in New York City, you're going to see cholera cases. You're seeing malaria, that cases, malaria, that's something I deal with in the jungles of Peru, not here in the United States. Dengue. You have the homeless population with hepatitis A being transmitted. You have all types of diseases. West Nile. We can talk about triple East equine encephalitis. These mosquito-borne diseases are going to be are here now because of the illegal immigration. And the reality is that if you're talking about forcing people to get a vaccine, well, why don't you force illegal immigrants to get examined for diseases, or they need to be immunized? I know for a fact in your state of New York, these kids are going to school without being vaccinated. I mean, it's impossible to vaccinate all these children, and they're going to be the source of infection. So for you as a future politician, is that you got to make sure you have a policy that is very effective for the community. It's not about feel good. You're not worrying about stepping on people's toes, because I can promise you, you're going to find out, and a lot of you folks have found out the reality of what a virus can do. It shut you down. It's had kids not be able to go to school. We have mental health issues. We have increased violence in our society. We have a disrespect in our society. And then one of the things I learned being on the congressional caucus for the COVID healthcare task force is that we have children that have been left behind and are never going to come back. So we got to make sure in the future that that doesn't happen. We have to have sound policy. And you as a politician, you got to have people on your team that are experts. Like we say in the military and special forces, we don't put anybody on our team that is not qualified. You got to have experts that can do the job, because at the end of the day, this affects people's lives, and people die in this business if we don't do it right.
Right. Wow. Wow. Very, very, very powerful. In terms of the audience attendees, anyone have any questions, final questions or comments you want to share before we close out? Oh, I do see we do have some questions. A lot of people was concerned, a little bit fearful, but it is our right as leaders to have the conversation. As we talked about, the world is moving forward, and things are taking place, and it's important for us to speak up and be on the right side of history, right? So, I want to just, before we close out, there are some questions and comments in the chat, so I'm going to open it up. I share a question in the Q&A. Ms. Sadiqa, I have your hand raised. You can come off mute. You'd like to ask a question or comment?
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. Thanks, Dr. Rowland. Thank you, Latoya. Thank you, Professor Bolson, for all the information. I wanted to ask, as a mom of three, and how should we as parents of small children approach the virus? Where can we find the right information? Where should be our first steps towards getting the right information?
Well, in my opinion, is contact me. I take care of everybody else, from Bobby Brown, Derek Luke. I can go down the line of people that I take care of around the world. And if you want to talk about it, you can always reach out to me. But at the end of the day, this is what it's all about: is making sure that we have policy and procedures to protect children, and because the children are very vulnerable, to certain diseases and stuff. And one of the things that we've had a big argument about, and what we've seen, is that how do you get a 3-year-old, 4-year-old to kind of understand their environment? I mean, do you put a mask on a 3 or 4-year-old? Does a 3 or 4-year-old wash his hands? What is the school policy? And at the end of the day, it's all about having the information and trying to navigate, i.e., finding out what the school policy is, finding out what is the daycare policy for that individual child. How are they cleaning that place up? Because if you go there as a parent and you look at there and there's no soap in the bathroom, i.e., there's nothing that has anything to deal with biosafety to decrease the amount of chances of infection, i.e., are they cleaning the school buses? Are they sterilizing the buses? then that's something that you need to be very, very concerned about, because it can have an effect on your child. But like at the end of the day, you need to talk to people that really, really, truly understand biosafety and infectious diseases in the real world.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Satika, for that great question. We'll make sure that both of the speakers leave their contact information, how you guys can contact them to follow up. Question from Mark, our last question. He says, what should be the role of bloggers and journalists who wish to assist the scientists with getting out the current messaging? You want to unmute?
I think
Dr.
Dr. Toby can answer that. I have no problem with that. Yeah.
Well, I want to be careful, because I think we have to be careful about non-experts, as we've heard Dr. Rowling talk about, non-experts have to be very careful when they're trying to pass along expert health advice, right? And so I think, can you remind me, the question is for bloggers and for people who are on social media?
So what should be the role of bloggers and journalists who wish to assist the scientists in getting out correct messaging? So how can we, and that's also something too, right? Because you're a researcher. How do we help? How do bloggers, and journalists help get your research out, get that messaging out to the public audience?
That's a good question, actually. I think, I guess, one of the things that would be important is to accurately portray the research, right? When it's being summarized or disseminated to others. Of course, you could share the direct link, but I don't think many people are going to go to the original sources to be looking at the academic research itself, or especially when you're dealing with medical research itself. So I think bloggers and journalists have a role. I mean, it's not. People have, we have to have sources of information. We live in a transformed media environment. And so I think there is certainly a role for bloggers and journalists to be highlighting sound scientific research and characterizing that accurately, perhaps with, perhaps contacting the researchers and getting their input before anything is disseminated. But I think they can play an important role. I think, of course, they're that's they're in that sense, they're like the rest of us in the social media world, where they different kinds of stories can be broadcast, different kinds of stories can be shared, different kinds of information can be provided. And so I think that's a pretty important role. And I think I'm not sure how to go about making sure that there's responsible sort of responsible journalism and things like that when you're dealing with blogging and in an environment that's not really one that's, I guess, regulated or the same kinds of gatekeepers. So I think it's much more challenging, but I think best practices, for journalists would be accurately reporting, coordinating with the authors, and sharing finding the, as gatekeepers, I guess, finding the right, accurate science to be sharing with the public in order to influence their views. I don't love that answer, but that's my best shot right now.
That's a very good answer, Dr. Toby. And the reality is that you're 100% correct. And that's a great question. I know for myself, I've probably been on 1,000 different platforms, from MSNBC to, Clubhouse, and you name it. And then in Clubhouse, it's a whole total environment. And people are talking about using juju juice that they could use to eradicate viruses and stuff. And it just amazes me, all the different platforms out there that have different messages that are going different directions. And that's what's scary about it. And for me, as a scientist, an infectious disease specialist, and a surgeon, to hear some of the stuff on Clubhouse, it will blow your mind, where people are talking about doing enemas to get rid of HIV, taking enemas to get rid of breast cancer. They had juju juice on there to get rid of all types of diseases. It blows my mind. So there has to be credible, platforms that people can get credible information. But some of this stuff is so far out, it's unbelievable. Then you understand why there's such a discord, because they have different narratives.
Wow, yeah. And just to add, and that's why I would also say, and you are Mark, so join the Economic Leadership Council, right? We're an innovation platform, and we're going to be doing our best to bring that information to the public. We're sharing that information with the public, and so everyone is doing their part. So with that, we're going to close out. We're about 6 minutes over time. I'm really excited about this content. This is the first conversation, but it won't be the last. Thank you so much, Dr. Rowling, for your inspiration. Thank you, Professor Bolson, for your research and your commitment, both tonight and all of you this evening. You guys could do anything Sunday evening, but you chose to be here to be a part of history in this important conversation. And in closing, Dr. Rowling, Professor Bolson, please share with the audience where they can find you and contact you.
Dr. Rowling at IG at Dr. Rowling, Facebook at Dr. Rowling, but everybody Googles me anyway, so I'm not hard to find.
For me, you can reach me at TBOLSEN. That's my last name, T, and then my last name at gsu.edu. Or you can Google my name and find my webpage if you like as well.
Awesome.
Doc,
Thank you.
Pleasure, Dr. Toby. It was a pleasure. I look forward to working with you guys in the future. And this is the beginning of just part one, because we're going to be dealing with this for the next 5 years minimum.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you for your leadership both, and I look forward to working with you all as we move forward.
Take care. Good night, guys. Good night, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.